When it's time to help your son or daughter consider what school to attend, as far as colleges go, should the fact that some schools are sponsoring sex week activities, should those be factors taken into consideration? Best-selling author Juli Slattery shares some of her own thoughts.
But I've heard too many stories of kids that get sucked into this, and sometimes they never come back. And sometimes it's just, basically a train wreck for a few years before they can get their lives back on track.
Juli joins us next on the Survivor Support Podcast. Welcome to Survivor Support, and welcome to the inaugural podcast of Survivor Support. I'm Jon Uhler. I'm the director of Survivor Support, and on the phone with me is a very special guest, Dr. Juli Slattery. Juli, welcome to our podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Jon. It's great to be on, particularly your inaugural episode, so I'm honored.
Well, thank you. I can't think of anybody better, especially to deal with issues of pain. You're a clinical psychologist, and then you worked with folks on the family for a while, and then you felt compelled to start Authentic Intimacy. I know on the Church Protect website and then Survivor Support, we're going to be linking and featuring a number of your podcasts. It's a wonderful ministry. Why don't we start with, describe for us what compelled you to start Authentic Intimacy, and then where you're going. And you have a new book that is just coming out called Rethinking Sexuality, and your passion is sexual discipleship, and that will really set the stage for the reason why I reached out to you, because the damage that's going to be wrought upon these young people through the loosening of morals on campuses is going to be a tidal wave coming down the pike.
Yeah. I think we're already experiencing some of that, but it will increase. I started Authentic Intimacy with Linda Dillow in 2012, and it really began with a very personal journey initiated by the Lord of me just feeling compelled to spend more time with Him. So it had nothing to do with ministry or a burden for the sexually wounded or anything. It was, God was just pretty much saying, "Seek my face." And so I began to take steps towards really spending more time pursuing the Lord over the course of probably 8 or 9 months. And during that time, just began, it was a really radical time. I just would wake up in the middle of the night and just have to get on my knees and seek God. I just, every free minute, I was in a A.W. Tozer book, or it was something to help me understand more of what it was to have an intimate relationship with God. And so during that period of time, I started to get a physical pain in my chest. And I knew that it was spiritually related. I'd never had anything like that before. But the timing of it, and just the Lord would wake me up with this pain in my chest. I would just be on my knees praying to Him, what is this pain? And He began to just show me that, He was sharing with me the burden that the Lord has for those who are wounded and broken. And at the time, as you mentioned, I was working at Focus on the Family, and I felt like at Focus, we were flying at 30,000 feet, just dropping care packages for women. And that there were these women everywhere I looked who were really in agony, whether because of sexual trauma, because of sexual brokenness in their marriage or betrayal, because of sexual addiction and confusion with gender, you name it. But that sexuality represented so much pain for women, and that no one was really speaking into this in an intimate way. And so God just really, I feel like He's just sort of led me by a trail of breadcrumbs. Every day I get up and take the next step of starting this ministry, and the direction that He's led us since we started the ministry about 5.5 years ago. It's truly been a walk of faith, and just an honor that God would share a portion of His heart with me for the broken and the wounded. And and we'll just keep going with it. It's just the need is so great. I think about even the changes in our culture since 2012. The brokenness has just exponentially increased, and it will continue to do so. But God's word is setting women free and setting them on a journey of healing. And so that's what keeps us going.
As you were talking, it was interesting. I was thinking in terms of both we all hear the terms, the problems in the church today. But the church really, it used to be once upon a time, that was where people not only sought connection, but also had a lot of significant issues of life laid out as far as being able to think deeply about matters. And from looking over your new book, my guess is you are pretty persuaded that the church has kind of dropped the ball. And we've detached from the culture, especially the most important issue of sexuality, and therefore it sets young people up for being, as it were, groomed by those that have designs for them.
Yeah, John, you're right that the church has been most effective when we've been willing to step into the deepest levels of pain. And in the past, that has happened with poverty and illness, with people that were discarded and not cared for. But this issue of sexuality, if you study sort of the history of the modern church, you see where this came from. But we have adopted generation after generation of a theory, a philosophy that says that sexuality and conversations about sexuality don't belong in spiritual settings. We kind of say, hey, the church has dropped the ball, and that's true. But I'm looking at the church leaders and meeting with them and saying they've never been taught or encouraged to seek a biblical understanding of sexuality. Many of them are struggling with their own questions and issues, and they have nowhere to go. Where does a pastor or a women's ministry leader have to go with their own confusion and brokenness on this topic? And now all of a sudden they're being confronted with these issues like transgenderism and 50 Shades of Grey and the levels of pornography addiction we're seeing, on and on and on. And it's like throwing them into the deep end when they never learned to swim. And so our heart is not to blame the church, but to equip the church and to recognize that the average pastoral staff, the average Christian counselor just feels overwhelmed with the pain that they're confronted with, and they want biblical resources to begin teaching truth on this topic.
And as you say, that's right. Many pastors and their wives, they are, number one, just people. And number two, they met and they came together and now they are married. But it is, you'll be hard pressed now in this day and age to find people that do not bring in baggage into their marriage. And with so many people having experienced being violated in one way or another sexually, having had sexual boundaries crossed, that's something that can only be healed by talking about it, bringing it into the light. And so you have two people that come together. They may have these secrets that they've never disclosed. And so now you have sexual wounds that they've carried into their marriage. And now they're also expected to try to help other people.
Yeah, and they're not allowed to admit that they have sexual wounds. Because if you know that your pastor or your spiritual leader maybe has a struggle with pornography, or maybe your pastor and his wife haven't had sex for 5 years, they're not allowed to say that to anyone. So they can't get help and perspective. And, the other thing, John, that I'm learning over time is that sexual brokenness isn't just the presence of a symptom like attraction to pornography or like a traumatic past. Sexual brokenness can also be a very unbiblical view of sexuality that's rooted in legalism and shame. And so, there are many people in the church, including many church leaders, who may not have some of these symptoms we're discussing, but they still view their sexuality as something that is tainted and dirty and shameful. They don't feel the freedom to enjoy this in their marriage. And so at Authentic Intimacy, the goal is not just to identify symptoms, but to really reclaim the conversation of, what does the Bible actually say about sexuality, and why did God create it in the first place? And, that's a conversation that every single one of us needs. And pretty much every single one of us were never encouraged to pursue in a church setting before. So that's where our heart is, and that's what this book, Rethinking Sexuality, and this whole concept of sexual discipleship is really about. Is let's not just address the problems, let's reclaim the whole conversation.
That's right. So I recommend the book. It's coming out soon. But you co-authored a book prior to this, and part of the reason why I reached out, Julie, as I mentioned, is you have now young people that are heading to college. It's just not on college campus. It's all over, but we're tackling colleges right now. And this message, as it were, through Sex Week is being propagated. The question, of course, is what would smart people such as educators be doing hosting this type of thing? And you and I could talk about, who benefits. I think there's two things. You can either follow the money or follow the perpetrators. I mean, if someone isn't in it for money, then they're in it for something very different. It's sort of like a drug dealer. The most prolific drug dealers don't imbibe. Why would a college campus allow that? So we could talk about that. Maybe at some point in time that can be for another broadcast. But you certainly have people that would benefit from an increase in sexual activity. So financially, you've got condom manufacturers, Planned Parenthood. We can connect those dots, pharmaceutical companies and porn industry. But then also, let's say someone doesn't have any financial interest. Now you're dealing with a worldview that is pushing this. And so smart administrators, for whatever reason, are allowing this, and nothing positive is going to happen. And then part of what is going to be taught, or part of what is going to be introduced, and if a young person hasn't been introduced to it already, is the darker side, the more enticing side that leads to a darker side. Julie, you co-authored a book where you spoke to the issue, the phenomenon. You called it a phenomenon, and that's exactly what it is. 50 Shades of Grey. If, let's say I as a dad, I as a parent, I'm paying a lot of money, as it were, and sending my good daughter off to college, and let's say she and I have great communication. So let's take one of the better situations. That I care about her. We have put money away for her for this. We've done the research, and we're excited. She wants to be a nurse, or she wants to go into the medical profession, or a lawyer, or what have you. And so let's say we choose Northwestern, but we're not aware of this, or maybe she's not aware that they have Sex Week. Yale, Princeton, all Ivy League schools, Stanford. And when you connect the dots, just after these things are implemented, you have an increase in STDs and an increase in sexual assaults on campus. Nobody can deny that. Just do a simple Google search. But above and beyond that concern, my background working with the prison system and also survivors, I have inside information to know how the sexual perpetrator thinks, and what colleges do not understand, along with the other concerns we have that I'll turn it over to you, Julie, but they don't realize that there are sexual predators that will target enrolling in certain schools or teachers will teach at certain schools that have very loose sexual morals because half the grooming has already been done. So now you take a good kid, goes off to college, and now not only are they dealing with normal college life these days, but they happen to find themselves, let's say they aren't aware of it, and now they go to a school, and this entire week it's held on campus. School rooms are used, the library is used for Sex Week activities. And of course, alternative lifestyle people are going to lead some of these. It's easy to do a YouTube search and see some of these. and deviant stuff, absolutely deviant stuff. It's not quote unquote safe sex. We're talking sexually deviant stuff and the bondage stuff and the erotica. So Julie, speak to just the whole realm of a good kid starting to be exposed to this and where it can lead, and then look at the need for your ministry now. Look at the need for survivor support. So where a kid may not have had, regrets and injury, as it were, now coming out of that stuff, now they have a whole lot of stuff that they're going to be bringing into a marriage that just didn't have to happen. So talk to us about the concern of the phenomenon of this whole erotica push, as well as the difference between fantasy, fiction versus fantasy.
Yeah. Well, there's a whole lot of different directions I could go with that question. Yeah, I think first of all, it's important to understand for always where other people are coming from. And, as a clinical psychologist, sometimes I scratch my head and say, why in the world would people who know research, people who are intelligent, who are administrators or faculty of a college campus, encourage things like Sex Week? And if you know what happens during Sex Week, it is very much just encouraging sexual exploration of all kinds. And, I don't believe that these people, most of them, are intentionally being evil. What they really believe, and it is rooted in a lie, is that healthy sexuality means that there are not boundaries and means that you explore the core of who you are as a person. And so if that means experimenting with other genders, if that means experimenting with cross-dressing, if that means trying a different person every night, if that means 50 Shades of Grey, you should never feel guilty about engaging in those things. And so we've got to understand that all of this is rooted in an alternative worldview. And what is a little bit maddening is that these people that know better refuse to look at the research of what's actually happening as a result of this worldview. And, John, you're actually absolutely right that the tidal wave of sexually transmitted diseases and unwanted sexual contact, the research is now saying that 1 out of every 4 women on a college campus will experience unwanted sex. And it's not just predators that are coming on campus. We're actually grooming the men to be predators by telling them you can have everything you want, mixing alcohol with this, putting young men and young women together in co-ed dorms, sharing bathrooms. You're setting up a situation that can't possibly end well. And, there are just so many ramifications of this in terms of the spiritual fallout for young men and young women, the bondage, not just the BDSM type stuff, but the spiritual bondage that this creates, the shame and the guilt, the dysfunction, the confusion about sexuality. And so, that's why I believe it's so important to start the conversation with, why did God create sex in the first place? And how is it being distorted? Because if we just try to deal with the shame, or we just try to deal with, the sexual trauma, we're not getting to the root of what colleges are trying to do, which is frame a worldview around sexuality that is ultimately destructive. So, there's so much to this. And if you are sending a kid to university, you have to know what's going on in classes and during Sex Week and in the dorms and, during spring break. The hookup culture is real. All of this is happening. And the adults, the grown-ups, are actually encouraging it.
And, I guess as a parent now, in rethinking this whole situation, I would probably think twice. I mean, it's risky enough to send a kid off to college and call me a helicopter father, but, it's risky enough, but kids need to, they eventually have to, of course, become their own person and figure out what their morals are going to be. But if you found out there was a college campus that had heroin week,
Yeah.
right? That you knew that they were baking cupcakes with heroin in it and all sorts of things, I would probably think twice, because there's one thing to have quote unquote normal degrees of temptation, but I think on college campus, once you get out of college, you're not faced with that same level of temptation anyways.
You're not. It's ridiculous. You don't have to be a Christian to see how destructive and ridiculous it is that adults are putting kids in this position. We wouldn't put ourselves in this position. We actually have college age kids. We have 3 boys and 2 of them are college age. And we told our boys, if you want any financial help from us with college, you have 2 choices. You can go to a Christian school that we agree with, or you can go to our local university and live at home. But if you want to go to a state college, God bless you, you're on your own, but we'll love you, but we're not going to financially support you, because we've seen too many situations where really good kids, they just don't have the intellectual muscle and the spiritual muscle to combat everything that's coming at them, not just sexuality, but worldview. Professors that their whole goal is to get people to walk away from Jesus Christ. So that's kind of the decision that we've made as parents. And there are some kids that get involved in a campus life group, the navigators, they're really able to stand and make a difference. But I've heard too many stories of kids that get sucked into this. And sometimes they never come back. And sometimes it's just, basically a train wreck for a few years before they can get their lives back on track.
That's right. And then your new ministry is there to try to help them. So let's do a little role playing, Julie, if you don't mind. I'll be that hypothetical young person. So she's 18 or 19, or 17, considering college. And let's say Northwestern, but again, all the Ivy League and other schools. And so zeroing in, Julie, on the issue of what you had written about, 50 Shades of Grey, since it is a phenomenon. So let's say, since that's going to be a part of Sex Week, so you've got the proliferation, of course, of all sorts of things that are attacking the morals, but there's a certain element within that agenda, those that are propagating that are going to introduce, if the kid hasn't been introduced already, because it's sold in Walmart, that film is, and other things. So let's say they've never seen or heard of, probably rare these days, but let's say they are unfamiliar with erotica. Would you touch on that issue? Now I'm going to be this kid, and let's say I don't know what this is. So let's say I just think there's porn. And so I'm going to say, well, Julie, what is the big deal of this 50 Shades? People, after all, look at how many people, even in my church, I know there's people that read the book. I haven't read it yet. What's the harm? It seems like, and I've heard that sometimes it helps people's marriages. What if I start to kind of investigate that? What's the big deal?
Yeah, well, that kind of conversation for me would first of all be, hey, good for you for asking those questions, because a lot of young women your age are not asking that question. They're just diving into it. And so I think what I would do in that situation, particularly if you have a young woman who has a God awareness and wants to honor the Lord with her sexuality, is help her understand that erotica is a form of pornography. Even the culture calls 50 Shades of Grey mommy porn. And I'd say, what do you think of that? What do you think of the fact that the secular media calls this mommy porn? And have her wrestle through some of that. And then, continuing in the conversation of what do you think pornography is? What do you think the purpose is? A lot of what I do on individual interactions is engaging and asking questions, because, kids are tired of being told, don't do this, stay away from it, it's bad. And they don't know how to think critically about what are the risks, and why would you be drawn to this in the first place? And so a lot of what I encourage parents to do, and also churches to do, again, is this concept of sexual discipleship, that this is a discipleship journey of challenging each other to think biblically about sexual issues, and not just have a moral response of gay marriage is wrong or pornography is wrong. People want to know the why. Show me God's heart for this, and then show me how I can live out realistically God's heart for this. So I would love to have a kind of interaction with a 17-year-old girl who's asking those kind of questions. And the cool thing is, and I know you did this a lot in your ministry as well, Jon, is the research. Even if you never open your Bible, the research on what pornography and erotica is doing to young lives is just it's eye-opening. I can't tell you how many young couples we hear from, young married Christian couples who the man has no interest in sex with his wife at the age of 25 or 30, or he's physically unable to perform with his wife because of being trained on pornography. And even people that have no sense of God or the Bible are saying, porn is killing sex because of how it tricks your brain in how to respond. You can get into what you're doing with objectifying other people through sex. And there's so many different discussions we can have without quoting chapter and verse that support God's design for sexuality and marriage.
And Julie, you had mentioned in a previous broadcast on Family Life Today, as you and your co-author were talking about your book. And again, that book is Pulling Back the Shades. So I strongly recommend that. We'll have a link to that book, as well as the program. But you emphasized two things, and I am aware of the time. It has gone by fast. Two things. You distinguished between fiction versus fantasy, and how that needs to be understood, and then how this erotica substitutes for the real and the legitimate longings of a woman's heart. As we kind of bring things to a close, why don't I give you the last word with those two issues, speaking to the young person that is on a college campus or heading that way, talking about the importance of understanding the difference between fiction versus fantasy, and then what Longings erotica is attempting to fill.
Yeah, absolutely. So fiction versus fantasy. Fiction is a story that's not true, but could be true. So, you're living within the normal realm of reality if you write a fictional book or you watch a movie, just about a fictional story. Fantasy, on the other hand, is asking you to take a leap into suspending what we know to be true about the world. So a great example of fantasy is Star Wars. They tell you when the movie starts in a galaxy far, far away, and it starts describing a reality that is completely outside of what we experience here on Earth. And so fantasy can be fun in terms of something like Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, where you have animals that talk or things like that. But when you're entering a fantasy situation, you don't expect animals to talk to you. You're like, hey, this is just kind of to going in a different universe, sort of. What you need to understand about erotica, and I would say pornography, is that these, like 50 Shades of Grey, is presented as fiction, but it truly is fantasy, because what it presents in terms of this relationship between two fictional people is something that can't possibly happen in real life. You can't possibly be drawn to somebody who wants to put you in a bondage relationship, and that turns out to be this loving, healing experience. That's just one example. But in some ways, pornography is the same way. It presents a view of sexuality and things that are possible that are impossible. And so we need to be wise in knowing that not only are things like erotica and pornography immoral, but without realizing it, it's making you expect something that is totally impossible and untrue. And that's why in the real world, when you think, hey, this hookup relationship is going to be satisfying and I'm going to feel loved, in reality, the hookup relationship, the next day, you feel sick, you feel guilty, you feel shame, you feel used. You'll never see that reality portrayed in what we're seeing in this culture. And then you mentioned, what is erotica? What is it plugging into in terms of and exploiting a woman's desires and longings? And in pulling back the shade, Anna and I write about 5 different longings that 50 Shades of Grey really pulls on. And I think what we got to understand is that these longings are God-given longings. Like some of the longings include wanting to be special to a man, chosen by a man. And that is a longing that is represented in every romance story. And I believe that God put that longing in a woman's heart because it ultimately has a spiritual reflection of the church and God's people being chosen by Him. And so there's even a spiritual purpose behind these longings. The longing to make a difference in a man's life is twisted in erotica, like 50 Shades of Grey. The longing to be sexually satisfied and fulfilled. These are not bad longings, but what the enemy always does is he takes our longings and he presents a counterfeit, saying, hey, this will satisfy you. Where the Proverbs said it thousands of years ago, you think that this is going to satisfy you, but when you're done, you're going to see death and decay. And that's what we're experiencing in our culture as young people are experimenting with all these things, and then they end up with just a heap of brokenness and regret.
Well, Julie, I so appreciate your willingness to come on our program, our inaugural program, and share your expertise. And I strongly recommend people head over to your website, AuthenticIntimacy.com. Is that correct?
That's it. Yep. You can find everything we do there.
There you go. Well, it's a tremendous ministry. And in a way, we're all kind of coming at this battle, trying to help from different angles.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, we need an army. That's for sure.
That's right.
So thank you for what you're doing, and thanks so much for inviting me to be part of it.
And thanks for being a part of our broadcast. You've been listening to the Survivor Support Podcast. You can find out more about Survivor Support at survivorsupport.net.